This is episode 148. Those of you who follow me on social media already know that last week I was in Paris attending and making short presentation at the 7th International Journalist Symposium on Conservation and Sustainable Use of Wildlife Resources. There it is, yours truly in the brochure. And also after the next day, after that symposium, there was a 69th General Assembly of the CIC. Of course, CIC stands for International Council for Game and Wildlife Conservation. Okay, so this is very established, old hunting organization. And the whole thing was just an experience. And no less part of that experience was Rob Yorke. You know who Rob Yorke is, probably, if you listen to this podcast. If you don't know, you will know after listening to this episode. Rob is an environmental dialogue broker. And what is environmental dialogue broker? We're going to dive in the episode. I took microphones and recorder and cables and even small camera and flew with them all the way from Ireland to Paris to record an episode with Rob, as if I couldn't do it online. Probably I couldn't. And as usual, before I let you enjoy this episode of the podcast, remember to subscribe to my newsletter if you haven't already, okay? It is very important, so you subscribe to the newsletter, because in that newsletter, there's way more things than just notifications about the new episodes of the podcast. So link is in the description of the show. Go in there, click the link, subscribe to the newsletter, and now enjoy my conversation with Rob Yorke. This episode is slightly different than the usual one. I'm here with the one and only Rob Yorke. Who is that eel? Rob Yorke, environmental dialogue broker. What does it even mean?
Tommy, that is a mean question this time of the morning, because I'm not hungover, I'm just very tired, but and I'm liable to say all kinds of things, so I've got to watch my blind spot, but it's great to be here, and we're in Paris, which is not a usual kind of backstop for me.
Absolutely, and we are just after the International Journalist Symposium on Conservation and Sustainable Use of Wildlife. Some people will shrug, thinking like, oh, use of wildlife, which was kind of like in parallel of the CIC General Assembly. So we were kind of like involved in the Journalist Assembly, and I just could not grab that opportunity and sit down with you and talk, because otherwise you just refuse to do it online.
Well, yeah, because that's the whole point about being here, is being face to face. There are conversations that we cannot have online, and this is one example of them. So it was about 7 years ago that someone said, hey, maybe you should join the Wildlife and Conservation International Organization, whatever it was called. And I said, no way, it's far too expensive. But maybe I can help them to kind of run some, kind of conferences. And then out of that came the this journalistic symposium. And the great thing about it is that it is a safe space to have robust face-to-face conversations with people who are not just pro-hunting journalists, but also non-hunting journalists.
It was what stand out to me. Like one of the questions, it was like, oh, I'm here to find out if CIC is not greenwashing.
Yeah.
And it was like all sorts of things. So that was like non-biased to one. And is that what the dialogue broker is? Is that what because I want to come back to my question, like, what is dialogue broker? How you understand it?
What is the eel in the grass? And I know that I annoy people because people can't quite put a finger on what I do. And yeah, I mean, you started with the word rural, and at one point I was a rural commentator.
That's why.
A commentator on rural affairs when I wrote stuff in the Times, and then the Times got rid of me, so he's far too complex. So I then kind of metamorphosized into environmental dialogue broker, because at one stage I thought I could do some kind of diplomacy and get people to come together and agree things and move on, but then I realized, no, we're still in the brokerage stage. And that's because of everything that's happened in the backdrop. We want to talk about conservation and wildlife and, hunting and other environmental issues, but no, we've got to be aware of the backdrop right now. We've got Brexit, we've got climate change. Climate change is the big one. It's been increasing in speed. We've got the Ukraine war, obviously. COVID-19 has had such an impact, an unforeseen impact. Partly, people now want to do stuff online, but have to have really tough conversations online, I don't think you can do it. I'm sorry, you can't read the body language, and 75% of communication is body language. It's not the spoken word. But I know you do a lot of spoken stuff, and I was going to turn the table, and I loved your presentation for one comment which you said at the journalistic symposium, which was basically, I ask hard questions in a friendly way.
Yeah, this is I know that you pick it up on that, and I think this is what we need. And like a lot of what people doing in the mass media, or like a popular, I'd like a term, use term legacy media, and that this is the theme that we were talking a lot about, what's legacy, where the world was and where the world is right now, and move forward. And I think that the connection, like right now, we're just sitting, and I can ask the questions that I'm genuinely curious about. And like it's like a child asking you a question, and the child will ask you all sorts of questions without understanding like what they really asking, like, oh, why are you so ugly? Or, so this is kind of like you could ask these questions, and then all of a sudden you have this atmosphere, this connection, and then you're asking what hard questions, like, oh, what was it?
Yeah, and also it's when you're face to face, you can sometimes see what's the question they're not asking. It's seeing between the lines, and you can only do that when you're in a conference or in a room, and you can kind of you're starting to see where the gaps are. Now, social media, I mean, we could probably spend a whole lot of time talking about social media because it's a great way of exchanging information, but to have conversations is a bit of a disaster. In the UK, we are seeing a lot of, let's say, tension and interaction between people in the rural sector, whether it's farming and forestry and land managers. And there's a lot of tension which, needs to be discussed. But when it's done online, people forget that it affects real people. And so we're saying stuff online which we wouldn't say face to face.
Not only that, I heard that quote, I don't remember who said it, that they look at people they know in the life, and then they look at their Twitter presence, and they like, I would never consider even, talking to that person based on their presence online. Yet I know that person, he's my friend or she's my friend. They're lovely people. But if I didn't know them personally and just look like, what are they doing? I would never, and I feel about certain people like that they're lovely people. They no names obviously, but they're lovely people. I love talking to them, and they're great. But then you look at their online presence, and you're just like, oh, just like, you don't do these things. Why?
Well, I mean, we're going through some really tough times. Our brains are rewiring to these new ways of communicating. So we're never going to get away from online stuff, from social media. But we've got to somehow realign, repurpose ourselves. And that, in a way, brings me back towards hunting, because that expression you said, one of the journalists said, hey, is this just about greenwash? And we could apply the same thing to many rural primary industries. So I use the word industries, and that is basic agriculture, hunting, forestry, aquaculture. And people don't like the word industry, but that's what we're talking about, because it's at the front line of the environment. And it's how to come away from the extractive nature of some of these industries and turn them into a more cyclical. And that is not an easy thing to do without some kind of truth and reconciliation as to what happened in the past. Hunting, in fact, I mentioned this in my short vlog before this event. Hunting within scientific papers is always to do with the decline, extermination, or, the damage to wildlife. Yet in the modern context, if we can accept that happened in the past, the same as farming after the Second World War in the UK, hedges pulled out because that's what the government asked them to do. Now farmers are putting hedges back in. Now hunters can become part of conservation's solutions. But there has to be some kind of reconciliation as to what happened in the past. And I think we can have some, in order to have those conversations, I think we've got to find some really good spaces, and they can't be sponsored by the protagonists. I mean, I was just reading a great article in The Economist all about the peace agreement. It's the 25-year peace agreement of the Northern Ireland peace accord, etc. And those guys, let's not go too deep into politics, but everything is political. Those guys hated each other. They wanted to kill each other, but they found enough common ground to come together and to be able to do what had to be done, which was some kind of truth and reconciliation.
No, for sure. Do you think that I think we can agree that we're talking about the conflict in the space of the nature and wildlife, or the various interests, and do you think that this is mainly because the fact of the matter is that the nature declined so badly? Sometimes I feel like if we have like abundant access and abundant natural habitats that are how they're supposed to be, there wouldn't be that much conversation. It comes from the genuine point of concern from both sides.
Yeah, sure, but it was always going to happen. I think there's sometimes people talk about this is a false argument to say that we can have lots of affordable food, lots of animals, and we have to kind of face the trade-offs that exist. So humans, yes, are part of the ecosystem, always have been, but as we've increased our footprint, as we've urbanized, we've then extracted stuff from the environment in order to feed the urbanizing population. Now that's happening at different phases around the world. I think there has to be an acceptance that it is going to be hard to offset. I mean, there is this kind of movement, or there's two movements: whole Earth and half Earth. Whole Earth are, in a way, land sharing. The idea that, yes, we as humans can interact in that ecosystem with nature, we can share it, but we're going to have to change a lot of primary industry techniques, how we farm, how we do forestry, how we do hunting, etc. The other one is half Earth, and that's retreat from half of the Earth, leave it to nature. And a lot of people were looking at COP15 and saying, yeah, 30 by 30, that's not enough. We need to retreat from more of the world, more of the land, in order to give it back to nature, which in theory is the land sparing. That's where you're sparing the land for nature and you're retreating to live in cities. I had the example of where I live in the Brecon Beacons in the national park, and the planning officer said, look, if you want to exist out here and have an economic smallholding, we prefer you moved to the town, because then you'll be connected to the mains drainage. We won't have to do your recycling. You won't have any impact on the environment. But when you want to live out there in the hills, you've got a septic tank. You have to use oil for heating. So it's hard to say, yeah, we can do it all. And I think we've got to be more realistic. Nature-based, nature-friendly farming is great, but it's a slight oxymoron, because organic farming knocks back nature to produce the yield. The big elephant in the room about all of these discussions is what we consume.
Yes, this is like ultimately, I think there's a lot more and more people are talking about it, right? It's not about the numbers. Did we have this conversation on the symposium as well, or was it like even before that, where it's like, oh, there's like too many people, and that's an argument that is repeated. I hear that from various corners. Sometimes very surprising. It's like, oh, do you think that? And then there's a point like, oh, it is not about numbers, it is about consumption, and we never should say those things, because obviously that, when you start talking about, oh, there's too many people, then the next logical step is like, oh, what are you doing? It's just machine guns and start mowing them down? Or
yeah. I mean, yeah. It's definitely the consumption. It is not the numbers, because the world population is now slowing down. It will start declining. Now, that doesn't mean that, hey, everything's fine, the world's going to be good. It is about how we consume it. It's in the Western, I've got to be careful, I use the phrasing, in the richer countries.
And then in the rich north.
Yes.
Plus Australia.
Yes. We need to reduce our consumption, but in other parts, we need to definitely reduce our calorific commodity consumption and head towards more nutritious food. In parts of Asia, they will be wanting to have the diet that we have, or we had. And so it's going to be very hard to manage that. They want to eat the meat that we're eating now. We need to eat less meat, higher quality meat. Now, I'm going to take some heat for saying that, but at the same time, we can't have these generic discussions without maybe referencing Africa, and the African states need to get more protein. There is the potential to increase farming yields, not by much, in order to give a much higher quality of life.
And not only that, but there's at the same point, there is an argument about fossil fuel consumptions, where African countries are like, hey, look, you developed yourself using fossil fuels to this level, and now you're coming and telling us that we can't, because you already screwed up your part.
Sure. And okay, we're getting into some heavy duty stuff about the IPPC, and that's probably not the right way of saying those letters, but you know what I mean. And also COP, the fact that they've promised, the richer the Western world has promised billions of pounds to go to the less rich areas in order to pay compensation, so they don't have to extract the fossil fuels. Having said that, we will be extracting renewable, minerals in order to continue the renewable advance as to energy production. Yeah, exactly.
The battery technology.
Again, there's more trade-offs, and I think we can be braver to talk about those trade-offs. Within food, within farming, within environmental issues. People say we need access to the countryside. We need access to green spaces, which is absolutely right. But there are trade-offs with that, and we've seen it with, walking dogs and things like that. There was a great story about people walking in, I think it was Romania, and they were attacked by the sheepdogs, which are obviously bred specially to keep the wolves away from the sheep.
Yeah.
So you can't have it all. We want more wolves in the countryside, but we've got to have bigger dogs to keep them away, and that's also going to eat people that come near the sheep. So what do we want out of this, and where do we want it?
And you're mentioning about that these are like difficult conversations and hard, and we need to be more honest. So I got to like a circle back to the fact that it's a different online conversation, it's a different conversation face to face. Because again, we have these things like if you're separated by hundreds or thousands of miles and you only see on the screen, you may not read your listeners or but at the same time, like, will you say the same thing? And now you have this connection, right? And like the lady who said like, oh, is it greenwashing? Like you can see her and you can. Like she meant it, but not in any adversarial way. It was like
mind you, I think actually in that particular instance it was quite adversarial, but in a positive way, because there's nothing wrong with harnessing the tension in the room. But that's the point. You've got to be in the room. At the same time, I'm going to do the flip side, and this will annoy people. I can understand that remote online gains access to a huge area, lots of people who can't get into the room because it's quite elitist to run a conference. I mean, how many of these conferences cost, hundreds of pounds? I mean, the amount of time I've had to blag my way in, I love the Oxford Farming Conference, but, you've got to find ways to get into the door, to get in on that conversation. And so the online, there's definitely ways to tap into many more diverse points of view who can't get into the room. But at the same time, I think we're still a lot of more creative, and I do use the word creative, and more, I was almost going to say cunning ways to kind of have these conversations. Walking and talking is a real luxury, but
that's what you're known for, right?
Well,
that's what you're known for. Tell us about it. Like, what was the motivation? Like people who don't know, like you have a very like a prominent presence on Twitter, and also on your YouTube channel when you're doing this walk and talk videos.
Yeah, I mean, it was way back. Actually, it was 20 years ago. I did something on Discovery Channel. It was a kind of survival fishing program, and I realized that television was quite interesting, and I enjoy being, I enjoyed putting my point across on it. Having said that, it's obviously not a platform for everyone. And then recently I've been thinking, well, you've got to make it pithy. I like writing letters in the Times. You've got to make it pithy and pertinent, because the concentration span of a lot of people, including myself, could be pretty short. So these kind of short vlogs I do are not, and again, people probably get a bit irritated, saying, what's he actually saying? And sometimes that's fine. Me being being irritating isn't the point. I'm trying to get people to think possibly in a different way. So my letters in the Times and my short vlogs are just to kind of come around the side, just look at something from a different angle, be provocative, but not necessarily want to change people's minds. But at the same time, maybe it is time to start to change people's mind, and I'm ready. And sometimes I'm surprised I don't get much pushback. I want pushback. I've had letters in the Times, I think that's really provocative, about badgers and stuff. There's no response. Now, which is a really interesting thing.
That might speak louder than any response. Sometimes, the silence is the loudest response.
Yeah, exactly. So you're being cancelled. In effect, if you're too nuanced, people want to cancel you.
You think so?
Yeah, I think so, because they want black or white. We want, are you with me or are you against me? Because you're not with me, you're against me. So I'm just not going to engage. And I noticed that. I observe social media, and there are people on it who used to work for organization as, let's say, environmental conservation scientists. They join a social media platform and they completely change. They switch off. They then go down what I would call a rabbit hole. And there's nothing wrong with rabbit holes, except if you become a gatekeeper, i.e. you start to kind of police everything that comes out on the platform. I just don't know where that's going to end up. Anyway, let's forget social media. Let's go away from that.
I want to go back a little bit to the hunting organizations, which I in the past was critical of myself, in both in Ireland and across the world. And what I see right now is like just a recent episode about the Woodcock research and the recent blog when I wrote about the NRIGC conference seminar, which were quite progressive, quite open-ended, and with many guests invited, outside of the club, if you like. And I think that what CIC does and what we witness is also kind of like this opening to the different points of view and kind of like getting a little bit of the air to get the new opinions and see, do you think this is, too little, too late? Do you think this is a right moment?
I think this is almost going back to the roots. I mean, I discovered, I was reading Rachel Carson, Silent Spring, and there was a foreword by the late Duke of Edinburgh, and he was doing the foreword as the president of the Worldwide Fund for Nature, WWF. So I kind of dug around a bit, and then I found a picture, bizarrely, a picture of him in 1968 in New York at some big dinner launching the WWF. And I looked at the picture hard, and I could see all the people in the kind of, I didn't know who they were, obviously, but I sensed, and I did a bit more digging, and they were all what you might call hunters. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, they were coming from hunting interests, and they were setting up a worldwide wildlife fund. And it's a bit like...
Is it not natural? This is like you said, these are the roots. This is natural. I was saying,
so
hunters...
here's another one, kind of, Sir Peter Scott setting up Slimbridge, which is now the Wetland Wildlife Trust. And I think, so what I mean by coming back to the roots, and, Aldo Leopold, in America was very much about hunting, about forestry, about land use. We can have some of these conversations which are not going back to the past, but we can reference the origins of what hunting is about, which is the conservation of habitat and ecosystems. And in the perfect utopia, it's the harvesting of the surplus of the wildlife, which is the utopia. However, I also accept that people hunt for different reasons. And in the symposium, we had some fascinating discussions between someone from France talking about hunting and that guy from Guatemala. It meant something completely different, the word hunting. And I use the word hunting in the UK, and people say, what do you mean hunting? What? Kind of hounds, foxes and things like that? No, I'm talking about hunting in a kind of hunting rabbits, hunting fish, wild brown trout. So I think... But people are so afraid to even mention the word hunting and the word conservation.
Oh, man, I got so much
heat. We don't
heat.
have to be, yeah.
Yeah, I got so much heat because I referred to trophy birding after reading the books about birding, and like a genuine point where, they have those lists and ticking off the birds that they've seen or not, or they I need to have 10 birds in their garden, and I said it's like a trophy birding. Oh boy.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, and you would have taken heat, and quite rightly too, because you were entering a den. You were kind of, I would argue, that you were... I
was just being provocative,
yes.
like this chap Rob Yorke.
No, I'm not. No, I'm gonna push back on that, because I like to think I'm not. Well, probably. Again, it all depends. Someone said the other day, they said, Rob, are you right in the nexus of all of these discussions, or are you an outlier? And that very much depends on where you're kind of, viewing me. I mean, I like to think I'm a little bit of a disruptor, not an agitator. A disruptor, this is my own interpretation, ready to be shot down, is someone who wants to disrupt the current narrative in order to take it into a new space. I would argue an agitator or sometimes an agent provocateur, excuse the French accent.
We are in France, in Paris, so
I'm really sorry. A kind of a provocateur could be more like an agitator. You want to keep it in the same space because it's quite attractive, because then you draw disciples in, ideology, you're going to attract more followers if you're an agitator. I've been on Twitter for 13 years now, but that's a long time, but only got about, I don't know, kind of 6,500 followers. That's kind of pathetic for the time I've been there, 35,000 tweets, whatever. I'm trying to reduce it. But what I'm getting around to saying is that I think we have to find our roles, and if it is as an agitator, I think you're going to get a lot more followers. Definitely, you're going to attract people, and then you might get more media coverage because you've got more followers. It doesn't mean that you necessarily are the right person on that platform, but on the flip side, a disruptor, I'd like to think, could help people have some of these difficult conversations, but without ownership. A lot of this is about ownership.
Like I mentioned in the beginning, like you are an eel, right? So I feel like I say something that I love eels. that I meant, yeah, and then it's like no, this is not what I mean. So I'm just not gonna, I'm not gonna assume anything, and I just gonna say something I said many times on the podcast and offline, that the unique thing I think about the podcast, and kind of like a thing that I do, is like I have people from the hunting space and people from the conservation space and the birders and other people who are online on Twitter and other social media, often at loggerheads. And then, I talk with both of them. And I said, like, I feel like sometimes with every episode of the podcast, I'm upsetting half of my audience. So some people say, like, oh, this is the worst thing you can do, because you can focus, like, who is your audience, who is your tribe, and just go hard into that. And I feel like I do a terrible job because I just have like this and this, and they, I'm upsetting both sides. I feel that you are a little bit like that. So that's a question. Am I get this right? Do you have that feeling as well, that you're a little bit like that?
I think, as I said at the start, yes, I remember I do annoy. Why I'm prevaricating, Tommy, is that I'm not keen on the word sides, but I know what you're saying. And I remember someone said, hey, Rob, some of the rural sector think you're a ride-on environmentalist, and some of the environmentalists think you're a mad ride-on farmer hunter type. So, people will put you into a pigeonhole as to whatever they want to do. It is, yeah. Well, I've got to ask you a question, is that I suppose by annoying both sides, you're doing a good job. And I've heard, and that's been said before, about other people when they're commentating on various political issues, left and right. You will always annoy one side or the other. And of course, the other thing is, if you're trying to set up a conference, let's say the conference was joining the Big Garden Bird Watch and the Great Farmland Bird Count. Do you see what I mean? One's run by a large bird organization, another one is run by a smaller farming and game organization. But the common ground between the two is pretty obvious, isn't it? Birds. I'm still working on how to kind of tease out the space to be able to join those two bird counts together. I'm forgetting it. Yeah, isn't it? It's the Great Garden Bird Count and the Big Farmland Bird Count.
This is very confusing for people who want to get into that space, because they also confuse. Like, I found that in the deer organization in Ireland, where it's like, okay, is this one not the same as this one? Are they two different ones? Then you have a different counts. You have two different seal rescue organizations that are like doing the same thing.
There's a lot of replication going on within the environmental sector. Now, I mean, it's naive of me to think that everyone who does a garden bird count wants to come to a farmland bird count. But there is so much. I think yesterday the bird index, the farmland bird index came out. Now that then influences how people talk about the environment, because they see it going down. But actually, it's slowing. There's some really positive messages coming out of that. So it's the way that different organizations, different, I don't want to say ideological stances, but there's an element of that can be pulled to one side. We can be less precautionary and more pragmatic by discovering a space to come together. There was a great paper done on farmland birds, 25 years of joint collaborative partnership between, I've hinted almost at the two organizations. I'm not going to name the names of the organizations. People can work it out, between the Garden Birdwatch and the Farmland Birdwatch. And it was a joint paper, and it's full of dynamite. When I say full of dynamite, not in an agitating kind of provocative way, dynamite of how we can actually do this, how we can get birds to recover within the countryside, and by implication within gardens. But it hasn't really gone anywhere because there's not enough collaboration within organizations to do a joint press release. Sometimes I think the environmental sector is being driven by membership and recruitment rather than by the scientists.
But isn't it's 100% true, right? They're like, I think like 2 episodes ago, my guest, I think it was Richard Prideaux, who said they have to be human-centric because dormice doesn't have pockets. I love the quote.
Yeah, dormice don't have pockets. Yeah, okay, exactly. So, you need to use the data and the information you have, and so you need to take ownership of that and take ownership of the narrative, because then it gives you a mantle on which to raise money. Now, okay, I think that's a really interesting and a whole big area to go to, and we can come back to your earlier question about, we're talking about hunting now, going back to its root, the WWF, the Worldwide kind of Fund for Nature. This organization that's holding the conference here, the CIC, is all about wildlife and conservation. There's other organizations who I think could strip away some of the stuff which is getting in the way of being able to collaborate.
Yeah, you mentioned data, and that was one of the themes that I also want to talk about. That was the theme on the journalist symposium, and also yesterday on the General Assembly presentations about the data. And on one hand, we have this push towards data and presenting the facts and visualizing data and, asking people to draw their village on the map and stuff like that. But then on the other hand, we have this aspect of saying, okay, you want to say something really badly.
No, I do. Yeah, no, sorry to jump in.
Dude, go for it.
I started to wiggle like an eel, didn't I? Because I'm
reading your body language, mate.
You are absolutely spot on, because on exactly that point, and maybe I've got too many thoughts going through my head at the same time. You say data, I say data. I mean, there we are. We've got two different ways of saying it. What I want to talk about was the State of Nature report. So the State of Nature report is a brilliant example of where you could bring the data, from so many different sources.
I learned English from TV, hence data, because it's American.
Well, that's why I'm here to not correct you, but to give a different point of view on that word. And the use of data is key. Okay, so the State of Nature report, and this is slightly what I'm driving at, and it always has slightly driven me, is how to find a way to bring more people into the room to provide the data for the State of Nature. So the State of Nature report is run by a large group, or it's about 30, 40 environmental NGOs, and it's every 3 years they do this big report, etc. In 2016 was particularly interesting because out of it came a phrase, nature depleted. Now that didn't come out of the scientific paper. The paper was actually Biodiversity Intactness Index. Now I mustn't run too deep right now, but what I'm saying is out of it came a press-friendly expression, nature depleted, which has now gone viral into lots of different contexts without any context. And you hear kind of politicians saying, we are the ways nature depleted, etc. The original paper was actually based on Southern African states who have an extremely high biodiversity intactness. So comparing the UK with maybe Botswana or Namibia, I think is a pretty harsh call because
nature depleted.
Yeah,
that's it. But I'm gonna push on. I'm gonna feel like a politician.
Yeah, go on. But it was really just to say the use of data in the State of Nature report. It could embrace other organizations who maybe aren't true, pure environmental NGOs, but also have great data, and they are hunting organizations, farming organizations who have data on their land. And let's not forget I'm talking about the UK now because that's the State of Nature report. I think there's one coming out next year. It's about letting go of the ownership of data and making it much more inclusive. I think the data comes in from about 9,000 different species. We've got 70,000 species of kind of nature and biodiversity in the UK. We have data on about 8,500, 9,000 species. That is then collated by environmental NGOs. There is so much more data out there that could be brought up into that from ordinary land managers, whatever. And that's just not getting in. And that's because of the politics between some of the organizations. So I am here to disrupt political manipulation of data in order to give it back to the people, to make it more inclusive, because then we can all gain the public good from having more data from all sources, can then inform much better the next State of Nature report, and everyone will have the logo on the back. It won't just be a particular sector.
I'm gonna push back now on it, and I'm just gonna come back to what I said earlier. And you actually said it the same thing. So we have this motif, this theme on the conference, and you give an excellent example of that, of using like, nature depleted, like an emotionally loaded term that then gets spread, and then young people going to the space, young and naturalists, we are nature depleted, repeating the phrase emotional. And one of the points made on the symposium was like, we really need to focus more on the emotional message, on the emotional packaging of it, because we see that a lot of campaigns like ban on trophy hunting are completely not based in the facts at all. However, they're getting a lot of traction because they have a very attractive packaging, emotional packaging. And one of the interesting things that I took from this event was like, okay, the data might not be, and the facts might not be that important as you think. Probably this emotional messaging is more important.
You're sure. And actually, at the symposium, I had a paper which I was going to share. In fact, I will share it online. There we are. The use of online is good, and it's basically, facts do not change minds. And actually,
yes,
Tim Harford, he's a kind of BBC Radio 4 guy. He does economics, but also he's written some great stuff about facts do not change minds. We can look at the tobacco history. And before I go down the rabbit hole, and it's a really interesting area that the scientific facts will not change minds. So you're absolutely right. Emotion, and you're absolutely right to say emotions are part of this. And I do hear it quite often, especially from some of the scientists saying, we need to get away from the emotion. We need to just use pure evidence-based. And I'm going, no. You have to accept the playing field involves emotion. And so we have to find a way to blend the data and the facts into, and some people would say storytelling is a better way of doing it. So storytelling where you can bring in the hard evidence, the evidence base, and is that evidence informed? Is that, it's about bringing the evidence in. But having said that, the evidence itself, science is uncertain. Everyone seems to sometimes think science is certain. There's the paper. Can you replicate it? Can it be done in 10 years' time?
That's another thing. You can find peer-reviewed papers on any, to prove almost any given point, whatever you want. And it pains me when someone says like, just you educate yourself. It's it's science. No. That science is a process. It's a scientific process that involves a lot of change. So I love the idea of getting more of the storytelling, like you said, and also emotional messaging on top of the data as we know as it is.
So this brings me back to COP15. So this hunting conference is all about biodiversity, or that's in their headline. I think it says restore, rewild, remind, and it's all about biodiversity 2030. COP15 was really interesting because there are 23 targets, and a lot of them are about local communities and anecdotal. They don't use the word anecdotal, but the knowledge of local communities. Even some of that, what I call hardcore scientists, acknowledge that anecdotal evidence needs to be blended with the empirical hard evidence. So trying to bring this, to kind of distill this back to what we're trying to do with, let's say, the state of nature. It's to engage the emotions, and that's where people use nature-depleted expressions to kind of engage with the media and emotion. That is an emotional charged phrase, and it is generally right, but then we need to set the context which does need to bring in some some hard science to show that that's happening. But at the same time, the science can be used to show how things are improving in certain areas. Now, people will say, don't you dare say that, Rob, because that will give people the false idea that things are getting better. And I would say, no, hang on, if we're going to use evidence-based, we've also got to show some evidence of things getting better in order to sustain some kind of hope to keep people in the room. Because I think we've got to really worry about is doom, eco-doom, and people are kind of almost switching off, or they're becoming so tribal and so binary, saying, well, I can't, I'm now distancing myself, and then you're losing engagement. And then when you lose engagement, the vacuum will be filled by potentially more hardcore views from whether, at either end of the spectrum. And then the narrative will start to change. Then the media will report stuff, and then we can go down a really bad rabbit hole. So I think now is a real chance to use, emotion is really important. We are emotional animals. But I think we can be smarter at how we blend that kind of hard science with the soft emotions, and have these braver conversations about hunting, about how we change our diet, about how we change the farming, forestry. I mean, I think we should almost draw this to an end, because otherwise we could carry on running. And you got to get an airplane quite soon.
I have a one other thing to wrap this up, which is typical for me. Like, if you had the magic wand, right? or you were like a king of the world kind of thing, like, what would you do? Like, what would be your recipe to get this dialogue going and kind of like start moving things in somehow more of the famous magic wand question?
No, yeah, I hate it. Tommy, my magic wand would be to put you on a train right now and get you out of here, because I think we could spend another hour on it, because I'm not going to do you want me to do a little soundbite, which will then become the nature depleted comment of this whole interview, and I'm not sure if I'm going to get
Rob
down
Yorke
that one.
said.
Yeah, exactly. Let's be better critical friends. Let's have those critical. People are so fearsome, so feared of that word critical. But when you put the word critical friends, and you've got to keep the R in there, because if you say critical fiends, you mean the opposite. I think we can be a lot more. We can engage in, and it has to be face to face. I'm sorry, if we're going to have these really gnarly conversations, I think we can learn to argue, and I think we can still be friends, but we can have different values, but we can have that common purpose. I think we can take the emotions and take the hard science, but it's going to take time, and it's going to be, we're going to sometimes do 180 degrees, and that's a hard thing to do right now. So we may have to bear a bit more time, but I suppose my wand is, don't say something online that you might regret if someone then is going to buy you a drink in a bar face to face.
Smart words, wise words, Rob. Thanks a lot for this conversation. It's been great.
Tommy, thank you.